Hello, everyone. Welcome to Navigating India. And today we have with us Professor Nico Slate to talk about his book, Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, The Art of Freedom. So, Professor, thank you so much for coming to the show. And my first question to you, being born in Los Angeles and brought up in California, Mojave Desert, how did you end up writing a biography about Kamaladevi?
That's an excellent question. First, just let me thank you for this opportunity to speak. I'm really delighted to be here with you. And it's a great place to start. Like most Americans, I grew up learning very little about the history of India and nothing about Kamaladevi. She's not a well-known figure in the United States, and that's actually one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book. I think she deserves to be far more widely known within India, but also especially abroad as well. So how did I come to her story? It was actually in the library at Harvard University where I'd completed my PhD. I had developed an interest in the ways in which different figures from India connected to, engaged with, and otherwise formed solidarity with African American struggles. And I had heard that Kamaladevi had come to the United States, as in fact she had, and that she had formed some ties with African Americans. So I tracked down her memoir and sat down and read through it in the library and came to this really remarkable story that is in the book, in which Kamaladevi is traveling across the American South in the midst of the Second World War. She's on a segregated train, and across the American South in those days, transportation was always segregated by race. And she happened to be sitting in a whites only car. And the train conductor came and told her that she had to move. And she, instead of moving, challenged him, refused to leave her seat, and said, "I am a colored woman, obviously, and I refuse to leave my seat." And she used that term, colored woman, very deliberately as a bridge to other people of color, both within the United States and abroad. So when I read that story, it was absolutely perfect for my dissertation and also incredibly moving. And I realized right then that she was going to be one of the key figures in my dissertation. And ever since then, that was goodness, about 15 years ago. Ever since then, almost everything I've written has involved Kamaladevi to one degree or another. I've dedicated another book to her. She showed up in most of my works because she is quite unique in the degree to which she formed these strong ties with African Americans, but also in the way that she conceived of her own struggle for freedom as part of a global effort that was going on, not just in the United States, but throughout the colonized world, throughout Europe, throughout the world. She had a profoundly global vision. And that was one of the key things that pulled me into her story.
I think a little bit about your previous work, right? Previously, you have written this book called Colored Cosmopolitanism. And if I'm not wrong, the cover page have the picture of Martin Luther King Jr. with Sucheta Kriplani, right? A kind of a transnational understanding of movements. How deep are these influences and how did they flow about?
They're extremely deep and extremely broad. I think many people, again, especially in the United States, but also in other parts of the world, think only of the ties between Gandhi and Martin Luther King, right? When they think about these links between India and African American struggles, it's the Gandhi King nexus. And that is a very important nexus, and both of those figures are remarkably rich and interesting. But there were many, many other people involved in forming ties and bridges across these struggles. And they operated on many different planes. So it wasn't just about nonviolence, for example. As you mentioned, in the case of Kamaladevi, one of the key ways that she conceived of global struggles was through the fight against sexism and patriarchy. Right? Women's rights were always extremely important to her. But she was also very concerned with racism. She was very concerned with class inequity. She was very concerned with any form of injustice or hierarchy. And she was just one of many people that were deeply involved in forming these struggles. So many of her colleagues were also traveling around the world, forging these ties. Someone like Sarojini Naidu also comes to the U.S. and forms ties with African Americans. Ramanohar Lohia, of course, Nehru, who Kamaladevi has a complicated relationship with, is also very transnational and global in his outlook. So it's very, I think, important to recognize that the Indian freedom struggle was, in fact, a global struggle, right? And that many of the key figures fighting for India's freedom understood what they were doing as part of this larger effort to end white supremacy throughout the world and to achieve true freedom throughout the world.
I think I want to hold on to this point a little bit more. So, in your book, you have delved more about a 1929 speech which Kamala Devi delivered at the Bombay Presidency Youth Conference, where she tries to define what freedom means, right? And she
Yeah.
is using this transnational understanding, and across her writing, she uses the word world freedom,
Mm.
expansive freedom, right? So, two questions, right? How did Kamala Devi come to think about these terms, right? To think about freedom in a very a transnational, broader sense, right? Global sense. What are her influences?
Mm.
And a second thing is, how did she push this message within the freedom struggle?
Both great questions. In terms of her influences, I'd say the three most important, and they overlap, are travel, reading, and her colleagues. First, travel. Kamaladevi was one of the most well-traveled people of her generation within India. She traveled incessantly, both within India but also abroad, and that started fairly early on in life when her husband, her second husband, Harindranath, travels to the UK for her studies. Most members of the family expect that Kamaladevi will remain in India. She wants nothing of that. She decides for herself that she wants to also go to the UK and also pursue her studies, which was very unusual at that point. Unusual actually for any Indians to go to the UK, but especially unusual for a young woman to do so. And when she's in the UK, she and Haran travel quite a bit throughout Europe, where she connects with a variety of other very interesting Indian figures, including Haran's brother, Virendranath Chattopadhyay, who, as I'm sure some people listening know, was himself quite an important radical figure who had a very global conception of the struggle for freedom. So Kamaladevi's travels lead her to this global conception, and then they also connect her with other figures that are living abroad, thinking about the struggle in global terms. And then the third key piece there is her reading. She is a tremendous reader from early on in life. She reads voraciously throughout her life. This is a part of her story that I really tried to bring out in the book because I think it's often underappreciated. Many people understand Kamaladevi as a champion of the arts and handicrafts, which she absolutely was, as an activist, which she absolutely was, but they forget that she was also an intellectual and an artist who read voraciously and wrote extensively throughout her life. So I think from her travels, from the other people in her life, and from her reading, she really develops that global outlook. In terms of how she tries to advance it within the freedom movement, that's a really interesting question. I think certainly through her speeches and her writings, I'd say that's the starting point, right? She's constantly encouraging her listeners, both senior Congress members, but also youth, right? She has a strong connection to the youth movement, and she encourages everyone that that is listening to her or reading her work to think more globally, right? So that's part of it. And then I think also just in her personal example, right? When she travels abroad, for example, during the Second World War, she writes a series of articles that are published in the Indian press. And just the fact that she has traveled, that she's gone to these different places, I think encourages others to think more globally and hopefully to travel as well. So both through her writings and speeches and also through her example, she tries to broaden out the conception of freedom that's at the core of the struggle.
I think next I want to talk about Kamala Devi's dealing with the women's question, right? I'm using the
Mm.
word women's question and not feminism because
Yeah.
she's not very comfortable with using the term. So I think two questions. So what are her basic tenets when she looked at the women's question, right, at the national and the international context? And second, what is her trouble with the word feminism?
Yeah. Yes. Well, maybe I'll take the second question first. The other two questions are excellent. They're related. She sees the term feminism as a Western import that is inherently divisive, and she's very reluctant to embrace any conception of women's rights or women's struggles that divides women off from men and from others who are fighting for other kinds of freedom. And I think this is actually really essential to how she approaches all of her work. Kamaladevi sees the connections between different forms of injustice and thus envisions a collaborative struggle that tackles more than one wrong simultaneously. So she's never one to say, oh, we can only just focus on this and this will solve all the problems. She's very resistant to that kind of thinking. So it's not just about fighting sexism and patriarchy. You also have to fight against class inequity. You have to fight against imperialism and racism, right? You have to fight against caste inequity. So there's always multiple things at play for Kamaladevi. And she's concerned that the term feminism will narrow the way that women think about the struggle and encourage them to push men away and to fight only for women's rights, right? Of course, personally, I think there are many, many feminists and people who embrace the term feminism, as I myself do, who have a broader vision for what that word can mean. But I also understand Kamaladevi's critique. And as a historian, it's important to note that she wasn't the only Indian figure who felt that way, right? Again, Sarojini Naidu, her sister-in-law, also famously rejected the term feminist. And there were other Indian women who did the same. Also, most of them because they saw it as a Western import that was divisive. For her, the key thing was to attack ways in which women were constrained or limited or their freedom was hampered, but also to empower women with the responsibility to fight for freedom writ broadly. So, she's a key figure in the All India Women's Conference, the AIWC, right? One of the key driving forces actually in that organization. But she's also very involved in the Indian National Congress, then in the Congress Socialists and a variety of other organizations. And within each of those groups, she's always trying to pull them to engage in other struggles. So when she's with women, she's encouraging them to not just focus on sexism and patriarchy, but also to confront imperialism. And that's a tricky thing to do because there are women who say, well, actually, we'll get more advances for women if we collaborate with the British, collaborate with the imperialists, right? And just focus on this one issue. Why muddy the waters by trying to tackle these other things? And Kamaladevi says, no, we need to focus on fighting all of these things, right? At the same time. But then when she's with the socialists who just want to focus on class inequity, she'll say, okay, yes, class inequity is important, but we can't wait to confront sexism. We can't wait to confront caste or imperialism. We have to fight all these things at the same time. So she's always pushing people's limits in a way that I find very admirable. And that I think was really important to the way in which the movement over time becomes, and I think this is one of the great strengths of the Indian freedom struggle, is it's a deeply intersectional movement. And that's just a fancy word for a movement in which there are many different causes that are woven together, right? In which people are trying to confront multiple inequities at the same time. Kamaladevi is one of the key figures advancing that conception of the movement. And I think ultimately it is very important to the course of Indian freedom.
I think I want to hold on to Kamaladevi's women's question a little bit more. In 1900, she was coming up with these proposals of supporting co-education, and she was also supporting maternity leave, increasing the age of consent and age of marriage bills, rallying behind them. And on the other side, she has to face critique for number one, her sari, and number two, one specific incident, which is establishing a college for domestic sciences. So how do we tackle this? What is her? Is she a radical or is she a conservative? Where do we place her?
Well, she defies those sorts of boundaries. And as you noted, there are people within the women's struggle who see her as too conservative in some ways, especially over time, especially by the late 60s and 70s. Many younger feminists see her as too much of an establishment figure, too conservative. I think in terms of dress, Kamaladevi is always someone who loves traditional Indian women's fashion and doesn't see anything wrong with being simultaneously a sharp critic of sexism and someone who loves, buying beautiful saris and wearing them, right? She loves jewelry. She loves embodying those more traditional conceptions of Indian femininity and beauty, and sees no contradiction there, and neither do I. In terms of domestic science, she really pushes back against the idea that empowering women has to mean that they leave the home and work outside of the home. From Kamaladevi's perspective, it should really be up to the woman to decide what she feels called to do. And there's nothing wrong whatsoever with deciding that one is called to work within the home, right? To cook or to prepare, the home, to bring beauty into the home. All of those things actually Kamaladevi sees as extraordinarily important. Her argument is that actually they need to be valued more. Right? That the problem isn't that women are working in the home. The problem is that work is not being valued and appreciated. And part of why she supports creating that college is that she sees this as an opportunity to take seriously the work that many Indian women are doing, including women who work outside of the home, because of course one must remember that this idea that women are constrained to the home is really a middle class or upper class idea. Most poor women are working, whether in the fields or in other forms of manual labor, and then also cooking at home and cleaning and taking care of children, doing all those labors. So Kamaladevi wants to recognize the full range of what women do, and then as much as possible empower them to decide for themselves where their calling is. And Kamaladevi herself, of course, has to struggle to figure out how she can be an activist, a writer, an actress, traveling the world, but also be a mother. How she balances all that, and that's not easy for her. But she knows from a very early age that she's not going to be happy only being a mother. Right? These other things are also very important to her, so she has to figure out how to balance the range of challenges. And as a biographer, I think she does a really good job of it.
I want to talk about Kamala Devi's personal life, but before
Mm.
that question, I want to go to 1930, right? Uh,
Yeah.
we have the Salt Satyagraha being launched by Gandhi, and you use the word she was completely flabbergasted, right? When she felt that women are going to be marginalized in that struggle because Gandhi, none of the people who are going to be with Gandhi in that march is a woman, right?
Yeah.
And she played a very key role there. So, can we explore that particular?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was one of my favorite chapters to write, actually, because there's such a thick police file on Kamaladevi in those years. So you can use these police records in order to present a very fine-grained and nuanced portrait of Kamaladevi's involvement in the Salt Satyagraha. As you mentioned, really the key beginning moment is when she learns that that Gandhi has decided to limit the Salt March and actually the larger struggle to men's participation. He has a vision for how women will be involved, but he doesn't want them involved in the most confrontational facets of direct action. And she is one of many women to criticize that decision, but she's one of the very few who actually goes directly to Gandhi, joins the Salt March, and says, listen, this is not in accord with your own conception of nonviolence, right? One of Gandhi's arguments is that nonviolence is powerful precisely because it's open to anyone. Anyone can do it. And so Kamaladevi says, well, you need to open the movement entirely. And Gandhi, to his credit, agrees and changes his vision for the way in which women can participate. Kamaladevi then becomes one of the key leaders of the struggle in Mumbai, then Bombay. And at first, the British are very reluctant to arrest her or other women, which gives her even more free reign. And so she is very, very active, producing salt, selling salt illegally, trying to forge bridges across religious divides, trying to bring other women into the movement. She's especially concerned with engaging workers and unions. Right, Bombay is a center of industry, and many of these union activists have been very hesitant to join the Congress. They're more pulled towards the more radical left. And Kamaladevi wants to try to pull them in and say, listen, if you want freedom for workers, we also need freedom for the country, and the Congress is the best way to do that. And she's trying to both broaden the Congress and pull workers in. So she's very, very active in those very consequential months. And the police records give you the sort of day-to-day vision for what she's involved in. And then, of course, she is eventually arrested, and it's one of her several periods that she has to spend in British jails. The last thing I'll say about that moment in time, which I think would be easy to overlook, but I find it quite compelling, is that, and I'm sure we'll get to the second half of her life, but, people sometimes divide the first and second half of Kamaladevi's life and say, the first half is political, the second half she's focused on handicrafts. But the process of producing the salt is a deeply embodied process, in which you're crouched over this fire and you're tending the salt and you're producing it. And I actually think part of what Kamaladevi found so meaningful in that action was actually the same thing Gandhi took from it, which is it's an opportunity to use one's hands, right, to directly claim one's freedom. And that is another through line, a sort of thread that goes throughout Kamaladevi's life, is that she loves to write, she loves to talk, but she also loves to do. She likes to get in there with her hands and make things happen. And the Salt Satyagraha is a great opportunity for her to do that.
No, that is interesting because I think I should have mentioned this already. How initially actually ridiculed salt satyagraha. Wow, is this the great idea your great leader has got in that we have to produce salt, right? And I think that brings a in direct confrontation with many key figures, right? With Gandhi, with Nehru and Patel, right? Especially with Gandhi. Can we track the trajectory of the relationship of Kamaladevi and Gandhi? So how did it go?
Yeah, it's one of the most dynamic relationships in the book and a really fascinating one. I think what's so intriguing about that relationship is that Kamaladevi is one of the few figures who is extremely close to Gandhi and spends a lot of time interacting with him, and yet is never a true disciple of him. Right? There are people who, like Miraben, right, who become really Gandhian disciples and follow him in sort of all ways. And Kamaladevi doesn't do that. She stands apart repeatedly. Decisions that she makes that cut against the Gandhian grain, right? We mentioned her love for fancy saris, for example. Her decision to divorce her husband is something that Gandhi opposes. Again and again, her commitment to the Congress Socialists, right? Her opposition to the princely states. She consistently ends up on the more radical end of the political spectrum from Gandhi, and she doesn't hide that. She pushes back against him. She challenges him over the Salt March, right? Again and again and again. She's challenging him, confronting him. And yet, she is also very drawn to many facets of his approach to this freedom struggle. She finds many facets of his work very compelling. And I argue actually that towards the end of his life, she's one of the figures that is closest to him. They share a strong opposition to partition, and they share a strong commitment to working with one's hands, right? If you think about what really matters to Gandhi, one of the key pillars is the charkha, the spinning wheel, and his commitment to handicrafts and village industries. Who carries that forward into post-independence India? There are many people, but Kamaladevi is one of the leaders who's really deeply involved in extending that Gandhian vision for hand work and village development. So she's an antagonist, right? Who pushes against Gandhi, but also someone who's deeply moved by him and engaged by him and continues his legacy moving forward. And that's part of what I find so compelling about their relationship.
I think here is where I want to talk about her personal life, right? She is going to completely involve herself in the freedom struggle, and that comes at a lot of cost. It complicates her relationship with her son, it complicates her relationship with her husband, and it also complicates her relationship with her sister-in-law, Sarojini Naidu. And here, the Ragini Devi episode is something I found extremely fascinating. So, could you
Oh
please
yeah.
comment on this?
Sure, that's one of my favorite episodes in the book as well. So, okay, for those who aren't familiar, Rajani Devi is an American woman who has a fascinating self-transformation in which she takes on an Indian name and poses as an Indian dancer. She says she's from the Himalayas, from Kashmir, and sort of basically pretends to be Indian, becomes quite well known in the United States as an Indian dancer, ends up marrying a man from India who had come to the United States and was involved from the US in the Indian freedom struggle. And It's in the US actually that she comes to know Harindranath Chattopadhyay, Kamaladevi's husband, who is renowned or notorious, perhaps I should say, for having many affairs with many women. And Rajani Devi becomes one of these affairs. The two decide to elope together. They wait until the husband's out of town and actually sell the furniture and use it to finance their trip to Europe. Of course, when the husband learns of this, he's outraged and starts sending these series of letters to India, warning people that his wife and Harindranath Chattopadhyay are on their way there. Kamaladevi, meanwhile, has been arrested for her participation in the Salt Satyagraha, so she's in jail. She starts to hear rumors about all of these things that are happening. She starts learning about them. Rajni Devi and Haran are traveling. They end up in Sri Lanka, which is then Ceylon. And there they decide to split up. Haran knows that as soon as he comes back to India, once the authorities learn he's there, he'll be arrested. So he tries to sneak into the country. What Rajani Devi doesn't tell anyone is that she's actually pregnant, and it's unclear at this point, and remains unclear actually, who the father of the child is. Is it her husband? Is it Haran? She ends up in India, giving birth to this child, not knowing whose father it is, being shunned by many people because these letters have arrived from her husband saying, my wife has run off with this other man. And Kamaladevi learns all this in jail. And actually, speaks so strongly to who she is, actually sympathizes with this woman and says, look, this is a woman who has been, in some ways taken advantage of by a man who's now stranded without many supporters with a baby in India. And she sends letters to some of her colleagues and supporters saying, support this woman, go and help her, find out what she needs and support her. It's really a breathtaking example of empathy and sympathy. And one that will then continue down through the generations, because Rajani Devi's daughter becomes a very well-known model and dancer herself. And then Kamaladevi actually, later in life, there's a photo in the book of her giving this award in honor of Rajani Devi, right, to the daughter. It's just a beautiful story of Kamaladevi's compassion, of women connecting across divides and across generations. And it really speaks to who Kamaladevi is and was.
That is, I think, one of the most interesting pictures, right? Which genuinely should be, right, where Ragini Devi accepting a award from Kamala Devi, right? It's not possible. And I think one key facet that you explore throughout the book, how these personal experiences of her, it may be her diverse situation, or it may be her problems within the family, shaping her larger ideas or of social reform towards women. But at the same time, she never brings up her personal narrative, and you say she kind of universalizes it. Is it a kind of a coping mechanism for her where she really don't want to face herself?
I think it is. And I think it also is just an element of her shyness. One of the quirky facets of Kamaladevi's personality is that she is a deeply shy person who spends much of her life in the public glare, in the public spotlight. That's not, I think, unique. There are other people who are like that, but it is somewhat unusual that someone who is as shy as she was, as reticent to share her own inner life, ends up traveling, across the country and the world, giving public speeches, writing for the press. So she's a very public figure, but she also is very hesitant to share her public life. And you see this, her memoir barely mentions her husband. I think it's like a one reference, it doesn't talk about being a mother, focuses really entirely on the public life. She's very hesitant to share any of the more troubling facets of her life. Some of it is also that, she was a boundary breaker at a time when women could face a lot of fierce criticism, and did face fierce criticism for doing the sorts of things she did, right? From her decision to not live the secluded life of the child widow when her first husband dies, her decision to continue her studies, which was relatively unusual, her decision to remarry, right across the lines of region and language, her decision to travel to the UK, eventually her decision to divorce Haran after all of his serial affairs and his problems with alcohol. So all of these things are decisions that cut against the grain of what was expected of a woman at that point in time. And so she, I think for understandable reasons, was hesitant to, air all of that out in public, lest it get in the way of her own political career, and lest it detract or distract from all the things that she was trying to advance. And yet those, as you said, those personal dimensions of her story were very important to who she was. They were very important to her own understanding of the women's struggle, right? They were very important to the way she kept fighting for the rights for everyone to, decide for themselves who they were and what they wanted. Kamaladevi's conception of freedom was born from her own struggle. She had to fight for her own freedom, right? From the age of 11 or 12 all the way through. She had to fight, and that shaped who she was. So that's why, as a biographer, while I tried to not overstep the bounds of modesty and respect to some degree, her own desire to keep certain things private, I also feel like we have to engage with those personal dimensions of her life if we are to understand who she was and what she was fighting for.
Right. Again, now jumping into her politics again, a question which has gripped her early years of activism is between the anti-colonial movement and the social reform with British, right? At
Mm.
All India Women's Conference, she is interacting with Lord Irwin and trying to bring reforms to the women through legislation, through colonial legislation. And on the other hand, she's talking about overthrowing the British. And there was this huge conflict between her two roles at AIWC and as a member of Congress. How did she navigate to this? And I think this is also the larger question of reformers back then between the moderates and the extremists within the Congress party. So how
Yes.
did she
Yeah.
navigate through this?
It was a real challenge, as you said, because on many issues, on the women's issue, in regards to issues of caste, right, in regards to Hindu-Muslim unity, there were many people that said the way to advance these social causes is to collaborate with the British, because these are things that, at least on paper, the British supported, right? In actual practice, things were more complicated, but at least in paper, the British were supportive of women's rights and wanted to advance women's freedom. So why alienate, right, those in power? Why not work with them in order to try to advance these causes? It's a legitimate argument. On the other hand, Kamaladevi was strongly of the belief that the real goal was to get rid of the British and to establish true freedom, and that when that happened, then India would have a lot more power in order to advance all of these social reforms, right? So how does she navigate this? It's very delicate, as you said. And I think part of what works for her is just human relationships, right? Intimate relationships. So getting to know particular people in a way that they can forgive the fact that she, is going to go to an AIWC meeting with, Lord Irwin's wife, and then the next day lead a protest march against the government. She's able to navigate this in part just by trying to appeal to people on the human level. But it doesn't always work. I mean, part of what gets her into trouble again and again is that she is a radical, and she isn't going to stop fighting for India's freedom, and she isn't going to stop advancing radical methods of doing so. And so some of the bridges that she might have been able to maintain as a reformist ultimately do have to be broken, because if push comes to shove, ultimately Kamaladevi wants India's freedom, right? I mean, that's the key goal for her. The other key parts are constitutive of that, right? So what does India's freedom mean? Well, it doesn't mean full freedom if it's not also freedom for women, right? Freedom for Dalits and others oppressed because of caste, freedom because of class inequity. All of those things are constitutive of freedom. But she's not going to soft pedal her anti-colonial movement in order to gain those reforms. And that does ultimately, cost her some relationships.
I think that's where my next question is, right? Kamala Devi is looking at the women's question, looking at the anti-colonial question, and she also picks up socialism. So, what's Kamala Devi's democratic socialism, as you are titled a chapter,
Yeah.
and the relationship with the socialists in India?
Yeah. So Kamaladevi comes to socialism at a period when many Indians are drawn towards it. So we're talking the mid 30s into the early 40s. She is drawn both by a very old and deep recognition of poverty in India and the way in which poor people struggle. This, at least according to Kamaladevi, starts as a child, and I trust her in this, but I also think it really deepens and broadens in the early 20s when she goes to jail for the first time, and she actually meets other very poor women who are in jail because they needed to go into the forest to gather wood, right? Or, they were forced into prostitution because they had no other way to survive, right? And so Kamaladevi meets these very poor women and starts to recognize just how vast the class divide is. All right. As someone, Kamaladevi, coming from a relatively affluent family, it's a bit of a shock for her. And she comes to really see fighting against class inequity as a key component of what it means to fight for freedom. And then in the 30s, she's one of the founding figures, as you know, of the Congress Socialist Party. And as I said earlier, one of her roles within the Congress Socialists is to push them to not only focus on class, right, to also focus on other kinds of social reform, right, fighting sexism and patriarchy, for example. But another key thing I think she brings to the Congress Socialists is that she's never a dogmatic Marxist or socialist, and she resists any kind of dogmatism, any kind of inhibition to democracy or to freedom. And that means that although she is, appreciative of the achievements of the Soviet Union, and this is a time one must remember when many people on the left were not yet aware of the crimes of Stalin. They didn't know about just how little freedom there was in the Soviet Union. They heard mostly positive things. And Kamaladevi is one of the people who really saw a lot to praise in the Soviet Union. But she was also very quick to criticize the limitations on freedom of speech, on freedom of the press. Even before many other people were doing this, she was someone who was able to say, there are some positive things going on there, but there's also some negative things, and we can't totally emulate that model. So she resists being pulled, not unlike Nehru, actually. She resists being pulled into either camp, the US and Europe versus the Soviet Union. She resists that divide. And as a socialist, wants to envision a future in which there would be freedom of the press, there would be freedom of speech, there would be true democracy, but there would also be enough land reform and reforms in terms of property rights and other things such that poverty could be eliminated and poor people in India could be empowered. And so that's her vision. That's what democratic socialism means for her, is it means a democracy, but one in which there isn't the vast inequities of class that sadly are still with us, right? Not just in India, but in the US and much of the world. She had a different vision for what true freedom would mean, one that was heavily shaped by her collaborations with other Congress socialists, right? And many of those relationships will persist. So, Lohia, there are many Congress socialists, who will become very important figures in post-independence India, and Kamaladevi will remain close to them, but she still never toes the line. She's very resistant to having to constrain her views in one way or another.
I think this is where one more question, right? One aspect that won't get much of our attention is the question of caste. Is it because of her background of being a Brahmin herself? So, whatever.
I think it's both the two issues that I think Kamaladevi was insufficiently attentive to and overly optimistic about were caste inequity and religious divides or communalism. And on both of those fronts, she is more of a traditional Marxist or socialist in that she feels that once class inequity is eliminated, then these other forms of injustice will fall away. So she's very critical of untouchability and other forms of class inequity, and very focused on bridging divides of religion. But she never puts that front and center. And this is one of her weaknesses or blind spots. Now, in her defense, it's hard enough already to have, 3 or 4 other key things that she's focusing on. She's a very busy person. She's fighting against British imperialism. She's fighting against sexism. She's fighting against racism. She's fighting against class inequity. So it's not too surprising that there are certain forms of injustice that fall away a bit. But I think you're also right that some of it is her own positionality. She is a Brahmin. It's easier for her to say, well, the caste thing, that's important, but, that'll come when we get our freedom, right? It's another similarity with Gandhi. I mean, this is one of Gandhi's failings as well. And his views on caste, of course, shift over time. He's very outspoken in criticizing untouchability. But as most people that have looked closely recognize, he also, I think, is over-optimistic about the degree to which caste inequity will fall away as India gains its freedom. And Kamaladevi shares that, to a significant degree.
Yes. I think my next question to you. You have dedicated this book to Nico Slate and also for the artists of India, past, present, and future. And you start this book with a quote of Kamaladevi, which is, beauty is the soul of the freedom. And you end this book with the same quote. So, what is this beauty that the Kamala is talking about?
Oh, thank you for asking. So Emily Moan Slate, in addition to being my wife, is also a poet, and I wanted to frame the book both as an act of gratitude to her and all she's brought into my life. She also read the book multiple times for me in draft form, but also to expand and express my gratitude to all of the creative people in India, past and present, who have advanced both beauty and freedom simultaneously, because that is really at the heart of who Kamaladevi was and what she believed in. As I said earlier, she was an artist, right? She was an actress. She was someone who used her pen to create works of beauty in many forms, as well as to advance the causes she believed in. And for her, I think in the end of the day, it's both that beauty is one of the things you get when you achieve freedom, right? It's at the end of, if you imagine freedom as a road, right? Beauty is at the end of it, because once you have freedom, what's it good for? Well, it's good to be able to love life and appreciate life, and you have the freedom to be creative, to create art, right, with your hands, and to appreciate others who are creating art in various ways, right? So it's an end goal, but it's also constitutive of the process of achieving freedom, because freedom is about creativity, right? I mean, and very, very practically, it is, because if you're going to create a protest movement, you have to be imaginative about how you go about it. There's a deep imaginative dimension to the freedom struggle that Kamaladevi is very engaged in and appreciative of. But it goes even deeper than that. I think for Kamaladevi, it really is about what it means to be human. And in the end of the day, I think for Kamaladevi, what it means to be human is to bring together and wed this aesthetic appreciation for the beauty of the world with a deep, fiery commitment to justice. And you need both of those things, and they're deeply intermeshed for her, all the way through her life. She's someone who she wants to wear beautiful clothes and jewelry, go watch, elaborate dance performances, appreciate handcrafts of many kinds, and fight against injustice. And those things are all built together for her because, as she said, beauty is the soul of freedom.
So, what would be the key message of Kamala Devi if she was alive today? Because I think she's one of the last freedom persons from the freedom fighters era who has passed away in 1988.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
we've seen a lot of independent India. So, what would be her message for today?
Oh, goodness. I think one of the things that is obvious that she would say is that we can't stop now, right? I think that's very clear to me. I think she would feel very strongly that freedom remains an elusive goal within India and within the United States and across the world, that we've achieved much. There have been many gains, but there are still many things to fight against and to fight for. And then the second key message I've taken from her life is that we need to work together. We need to build collaborations across divides of many kinds, across national borders, across the divides of different kinds of struggles. So, feminists and socialists, people fighting against caste inequity, people fighting against poverty. We need to find ways to work together, right? Because these different forms of injustice overlap and intersect, and will be more powerful if we collaborate and we work together.
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor Nico Slate. I think this is a beautiful tribute to your wife, a great tribute to Kamala Devi. I think she'll be very happy that a white man working on transnational movements about African Americans picked up and written her biography. Thank you so much, Professor Slate.
Thank you. This has been an honor. Thank you.
Thank you so much.